The chains are still on her wrists when Lilli Frogner opens her eyes. The forest floor is cold. Not the kind of cold that asks permission, but the kind that has already settled into your bones and begun making arrangements. Her dress, once white, is torn and stained to dark, wet red that the morning light does nothing to soften. Around her, 3 massive wolves circle in slow, deliberate arcs, their breath misting in the winter air. Behind them, 5 men stand watching, not to help, not to intervene, to witness. She remembers dying. She remembers the Alpha King's voice, deep, absolute, stripped of everything resembling mercy, reading the rejection like a verdict he had rehearsed. She remembers the brand pressed to the back of her neck, the iron smell of it, the silence that fell over the entire pack assembly when no one stepped forward to object. She remembers the chains. She remembers the forest. What she does not remember is ever being this calm about any of it. Because the girl who loved Marius Rikstad with every fractured piece of herself, the girl who cried at his door, who made herself smaller so he might find her less inconvenient, who humiliated herself in front of every ranked wolf in Nordvik just to be seen, that girl is gone. Something else opened its eyes in the clearing this morning. Lilli Frogner lifts her chained hands, looks at the largest wolf, and smiles. Hello. We need to talk about who actually sent you. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The girl who was supposed to stay dead. 72 hours earlier, the pack assembly hall of Nordvik had been full of people who loved to watch a fall. That was the thing about pack gatherings. Lilli had always known this, even before she understood it properly. They were never really about justice. They were about theater. The careful performance of authority, the public management of hierarchy, the shared ritual of watching someone ranked lower than yourself absorb the weight of consequences that should, by rights, have been distributed more evenly. People did not come to pack assemblies to witness truth. They came because it reminded them where they stood in relation to someone else. They came because it felt safe standing in that hall to be a witness rather than the witnessed. She had stood in the center of it all and understood, for the first time in either of her lives, exactly what she was looking at. The hall itself was built for spectacle. Ancient timber beams overhead, carved with the wolves of every bloodline that had pledged to Nordvik in the 300 years since the pack's founding. Iron torch sconces on every pillar. The floor, packed earth and dark stone, sloped gently toward the Alpha's raised platform, so that no matter where you stood in that hall, you were always looking slightly upward at the man in front of the throne. Architectural dominance baked into the ground itself. Someone had thought of everything. Marius Rikstad stood at the front of it, and the first thing Lilli had noticed, even then, even in that moment, even while the brand was cooling at the back of her neck, was how still he was. She had spent 4 years memorizing him. She was not proud of that, but it was true. For years of watching the way he moved through a room like whether moving through trees, not with aggression but with the absolute certainty that he would not be redirected. She knew the set of his shoulders when he was making a decision he did not enjoy. She knew the particular silence he used when he was angrier than he was letting on. She had catalogued him the way a woman catalogues a thing she is afraid of losing, which meant she had never truly understood what she was looking at. She understood it now. He was not conflicted. That was what she had missed. All 4 years of watching him. She had told herself, the other Lilli had told herself, the one who ached and hoped and rationalized every cold dismissal into something survivable, that he was complicated, that the distance was a defense, that beneath the iron there was something warmer, if only she could be patient enough, small enough, quiet enough to reach it. He was not complicated. He was a man who had been given a narrative, had accepted it without interrogation, and was now performing its conclusion with the thorough efficiency of someone who had already moved past regret into administration. That was the part that severed the last thread of feeling she might have still possessed for him. Not the rejection itself. Not the brand. Not the hall full of watching eyes. It was the efficiency. The complete, administrative absence of doubt. He spoke her name once, for the record, And then he spoke the rejection, and then he nodded to the guards, and then he was already looking at the beta commanders on his left, discussing border patrol rotations with the focused energy of a man who had cleared a minor item from his agenda and was ready to move on. She had turned her head then, in the 3 seconds before the guards reached her, not to look at him again. She was done looking at him. She had turned to find the face she knew would be there, 3 rows back, arranged in the careful expression of someone performing reluctant grief for an audience of ranked wolves, beautiful, controlled, patient as frost, standing in the exact position to be visible without appearing to have positioned herself. Ingred Voss. High, beta female. The pack's most skilled architect of other people's destruction. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Ingrid's expression did not change. It was flawless. The kind of performance that required the absolute certainty that the person watching you could not do anything about what they knew. Ingrid was wrong about that. But she had no way of knowing it yet. The guards took her arms. The hall watched. No one stepped forward. The brand dried against her skin. The forest was cold and dark and full of wolves that circled without closing, and then Lilli Frogner died, more or less, and then she woke up, and now she was here, and that was the part she was still sorting out. The largest wolf had not moved when she spoke to it. That was interesting. Alpha-ranked wolves in Nordvik were not known for their hesitation. They were trained from adolescence in the absolute primacy of pack command, which meant that an order from the Alpha King, remove her, let the forest finish it, should have produced immediate, uncomplicated action. There should have been no pause. There should have been no tilted head, no lowered nose, no long amber eyes fixing on her face, with the particular focused attention of an animal trying to solve a problem it has not been given tools to solve. She filed that away. The 5 men behind the wolves were a more immediate concern. She recognized 2 of them, Rune Strand and another she knew only by silhouette, both of them Halvard Ness creatures, present not to enforce anything but to confirm, to go back and report that it was done. She looked at Rune and watched him struggle with what he was seeing. Not a woman in the last moments of her death sentence, but a woman sitting in a forest clearing with the expression of someone who had arrived early to a meeting and was mildly irritated that the other parties were not yet prepared to begin. "I'm going to stand up now," she said to no one in particular. "I'd appreciate it if no one made that unnecessarily dramatic." She stood up. The wolves did not close the circle. That told her everything she needed to know about the bond, about the order, about what it meant to reject a fated mate in front of an entire pack. Verbal rejection severed the public acknowledgement. What it had not severed, apparently, was anything older than words. Anything that lived in the blood and the bone, and the ancient wolf logic that preceded human hierarchy by 1,000 years. The pack bond, in its oldest form, recognized her. And a bond that recognized her could not easily be used to kill her, not without the wolf that carried it fracturing something irreparable in itself. Halvard had made a mistake. He had assumed that using pack wolves to enforce the sentence was safe precisely because the bond was severed. He had not considered that the bond might have opinions about that. She was going to find this useful. "Tell Halvard it's done," she said pleasantly to Rune Strand. "He'll want to hear that quickly. He has a great deal to manage at the moment, given the border situation." She paused. "You might also mention, if you want to be helpful, that I walked east, toward the Lynn River." She tilted her head. "I won't be going east." She turned northwest, toward the healer's cottage she had noted in a life that now felt both ancient and immediate, like a map drawn by someone else that she discovered she could read perfectly. Behind her, the wolves did not follow. The men decided she was either mad or already dead in a sense that counted. The forest resumed its ordinary operations around a woman it had decided, in its old and wordless way, to let pass. The morning was cold. Her dress was ruined. Her wrists ached in the iron. She had 2 primary problems and 14 sub-problems nested within them, a conspiracy to unravel, a king to manage, and chains on her wrists that she would need someone to remove without asking too many questions about how she'd acquired them. She had, on the other hand, 2 lifetimes of accumulated intelligence, a detailed memory of every pack meeting she had ever been required to attend, and the particular advantage of having been underestimated so thoroughly for so long that the people who needed to fear her had not yet remembered to begin. It was, she thought, an adequate place to start. She walked forward into the cold morning like a woman who had already decided how this would end and was simply attending to the middle parts. Chapter 2. Do not mistake silence for surrender. Sigrun Blix had been the pack healer for 41 years, which meant she had seen enough to know that the most dangerous thing in any room was rarely the thing making the most noise. She was grinding dried yarrow at her work table when the door opened. She did not look up immediately. Visitors to her cottage fell into predictable categories: injured wolves too proud to admit it, pregnant women needing something their mates couldn't be told about, young ranked wolves who had heard she knew things and wanted to know if that was true. She had developed a reliable taxonomy over 4 decades, and she applied it now, listening to the particular sound of the footsteps crossing her threshold. Measured. Deliberate. Not the gait of someone in pain, though the smell told her. Iron, cold, old blood, that pain was present. Not the gait of someone afraid, which was stranger still, given what she could smell. She looked up. Lilli Frogner stood in her doorway wearing a ruined white dress, iron chains on both wrists, a brand healing badly at the back of her neck, and the expression of someone arriving to a scheduled appointment they have been looking forward to. She looked, Sigrun thought, nothing whatsoever like the girl she remembered. I need the chains removed, Lilli said, and I need about 2 hours of your time and access to your record books from the last 18 months. I'll explain why in a moment. First, do you have tea? Sigrun set down the arrow. Sit down, she said. Lilli sat. Sigrun brought tea, then fetched her iron shears from the shelf, where she kept things the pack's ranked wolves didn't need to know about. She cut the chains off Lilli's wrists without commentary and examined the damage underneath with the thorough attention of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people did to each other. You're not what I expected, Sigrun said, working salve into the abraded skin with practiced hands. What did you expect? Whatever she was. The girl who loved him. Sigrun did not elaborate on who him was. There was only one him in this context, and they both knew it. Lilli looked at her wrists where Sigrun was working and said nothing for a moment. She's gone, she said finally. Not with grief. With the particular neutrality of a clinical assessment. I'm something else. Sigrun believed her. She had seen enough wolves broken and rebuilt to know the difference between a woman performing recovery and a woman who had fundamentally reorganized. This was the latter, and it was strange and unsettling in a way she found, if she was honest, deeply interesting. She brought more salve and more tea, and waited. Lilli began to talk. She was careful about it, careful in a way that suggested she had already mapped exactly what Sigrun needed to know versus what she needed to keep close. She did not explain the rebirth. She did not attempt to describe the particular phenomenon of 2 lifetimes occupying one body, because Sigrun had not asked, and because the explanation would consume time she did not have. What she explained instead was simpler and more immediately actionable. She had information about the border incidents. Specific, verifiable, deeply inconvenient information about who was behind them and why. She needed 3 things. The chains disposed of cleanly, access to the healer's administrative records. Pack healers kept detailed movement logs. It was one of the few official functions that required noting who was where and when, and Sigrun silence, for approximately 1 week, while she established herself somewhere she could operate. She laid it out with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent her first life presenting quarterly strategy reviews to rooms full of skeptical executives. Structured. Sequenced. No wasted words. Sigrun listened. When Lilli finished, the old healer was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. The border incidents, Sigrun said.
Alvar nesse.
It was not a question. I didn't say that, Lilli said. No, Sigrun agreed. You were very careful not to. She looked at Lilli steadily. I've been careful not to say it for 6 months. I didn't have the right pieces. I had a pattern in my records, wolves moving in ways that didn't match their assigned routes, showing up injured in ways that didn't match training accidents, requesting specific supplies in specific quantities at intervals that didn't make sense for the work they were supposed to be doing. She paused. I didn't know what I was looking at. You were looking at a smuggling operation using patrol wolves as couriers, Lilli said. The injuries are from border crossings, not training. The supply requests are cover for equipment being moved out of pack territory. Sigrun was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, went to the locked cabinet at the back of her workroom, and returned with 3 leather-bound record books and set them on the table between them. "I'll need more tea," she said, "if we're going to do this properly." They worked for 3 hours. Lilli went through the records with the focused speed of someone who knew exactly what pattern she was looking for and moved straight to it each time, pulling dates, names, and supply requisitions into a coherent sequence that told a story any Alpha commander would recognize. Sigrun watched the way her mind moved, lateral, fast, connecting points that seemed unrelated until she connected them and then seemed obvious, and thought about the girl she remembered from pack gatherings, the one who had stood too close to Marius Rickstad and wanted too visibly, and been too easy to dismiss. She thought about how useful it was, in certain circumstances, to have been dismissed. By the time they finished, the winter afternoon light had gone gray at the windows. Lilli organized the notes she had made into a precise sequence and folded them into the inside of the patched wool cloak Sigrun had produced from a chest that predated, by some years, the current Alpha King's reign. "There's a room above the storehouse," Sigrun said. "The pack stopped using it for overflow supplies 2 seasons ago. It locks from the inside." She paused. "I don't ask questions I already know the answer to." "I know," Lilli said. "That's why I came here first." Sigrun looked at her for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. Not with alarm. With the careful curiosity of a woman who had spent 4 decades watching the pack's machinery grind people up and had developed, over time, a deep and patient sympathy for anyone who figured out how to throw something into the gears. Lilli stood, settled the cloak around her shoulders, and picked up the folded notes. "I'm going to pay attention," she said. "The way I should have been paying attention for a very long time." She paused at the door. "Thank you, Sigrun." "Don't thank me," the old healer said, returning to her yarrow. "Bring me evidence." "That's thanks enough." Above the storehouse, in a room that smelled of sawdust and old rope, Lilli Frogner sat on a narrow cot in the dark and began to build a map in her head. Not of territory, of people, of the careful architecture of who owed what to whom, who was afraid of which exposure, whose loyalty was performance and whose was bone deep, and where, exactly where, the weight of a conspiracy could be found if you pressed the right point at the right moment. She pressed nothing that night. She only mapped. Outside, the Nordvik pack settled into its winter evening routines, completely unaware that the woman it had sentenced to death 3 days ago was filing careful notes about all of them, 200 meters from the stronghold wall, and had already decided which of them would be useful. Chapter 3. The Alpha King hears a rumor. Marius Rickstad did not sleep well. This was not new. It had not been new for 4 years, though he had always attributed it to the demands of governing 5 packs under a single throne, which was the kind of explanation that was technically accurate and entirely insufficient. He was at his desk before dawn, working through the border incident reports that his beta commander had prepared, when Torben Haug knocked twice and entered without waiting, which was Torben's particular mode of communication, the knock being largely ceremonial at this point, a formality they both understood to mean "you will not like this, but you need to hear it immediately." "She's alive," Torben said. Marius did not look up from the report. Who? It was not a question. He had known, with a particular certainty, of something he could not explain, and had stopped trying to from the moment he woke that morning. The moment the ache he had attributed to the severed bond had shifted, subtly, from absence into something more like direction. "Lilli Frogner," Torben said. Runestrand's confirmation came back negative. She walked out of the forest. Silence. "She walked out," Marius said. "Northwest." One of the outer settlement residents saw her near the healer's cottage early this morning. Torben paused. She did not appear to be in distress. Marius set down the border report. He looked at the fire. He thought about what it meant that 3 alpha-ranked wolves had been given a direct order, and the woman at the center of it had walked out of the forest under her own power and apparently gone directly to a healer not to be treated but to ask questions, which was the detail Torben had not yet told him but which he already suspected, because it was what he would have done. He thought about what it meant that Halvard Ness had appeared at his door within 20 minutes of the confirmation request being sent, smooth and quiet and immediately helpful, suggesting that a secondary force be dispatched to the border to ensure the original order was completed. Halvard had never before taken an interest in the logistics of pack discipline. Marius had noted that, and said nothing. He noted more things about Halvard Ness every day lately. The collection was becoming significant. "Find her," he said. "Bring her to the border. Escort, not force. I want this clean." He paused. "Send Torben." "I am Torben," said Torben. "Then go." Torben went. Marius returned to the border reports and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing it. The ache, the directional thing that lived in his chest where the bond had been and apparently still was, in some form he could not officially acknowledge, had settled into something almost like clarity. He pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose and thought about the fact that a woman he had rejected before the full pack assembly, a woman he had branded a traitor on the basis of evidence he had reviewed twice and found unambiguous, had apparently walked out of a death sentence in the Nordvik forest and gone to ask questions. He thought about who had been most eager to ensure that evidence reached his desk. He thought about Halvard's face when the confirmation was delayed. He went back to the border reports and made himself read them, properly this time, and what he found when he actually read them, rather than accepting the summary his beta commander had prepared, was a pattern of incidents that did not match the rogue wolf explanation he had been given. The intervals were wrong. The locations were wrong. And 3 of the incidents were marked as resolved in Halvard's summary, but had no resolution documentation attached. He was still staring at that discrepancy when his door opened again. Torben had not gone to the border. Torben was standing in his doorway, with the particular expression he used when the situation had developed in ways that required direct report before any other action was taken. "She wouldn't come," Torben said. "She refused a direct. She told me," Torben said carefully, "that she would come to the border immediately after she finished explaining to me why 3 of last month's border incidents were not rogue wolves but coordinated provocations designed to draw patrol coverage away from the eastern boundary." He paused. She knew the dates, the locations, and the names of the wolves who falsified their resolution reports. Marius was very still. "She knew the names," he said. She named 4 wolves, all of them assigned to Halvard Ness's direct command. The fire made a sound. Outside, wind came off the fjord and pressed against the stronghold's stone walls with a low, persistent note, like something trying to get in or out. Marius looked at the border reports on his desk, at the 3 unresolved incidents with no documentation, at the pattern he had only just seen because he had only just actually looked. "Bring her in," he said. "To the border? To the stronghold?" He paused. "War room." Torben's expression shifted almost imperceptibly into something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. He nodded and left. Marius stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the Nordvik courtyard where the morning's first light was settling cold and white across the stone. A woman he had rejected 3 days ago was about to walk into his war room and tell him things about his own pack that his most trusted beta commander had not. He did not know what to do with that. He knew what it felt like. It felt like the ground shifting under him by a fraction of a degree, the particular destabilizing sensation of realizing that something he had accepted as solid was more provisional than he had understood. He had not felt uncertain in years. He had forgotten it felt like this. He went to the war room and waited, which he never did. He was always the last to arrive to anything, because an alpha king who waited for others to assemble acknowledged, structurally, that the others mattered. He waited anyway, standing at the tactical map with his hands behind his back, and when the door opened and Lilli Frogner walked in wearing a patched wool cloak and the expression of someone arriving to a meeting they scheduled, he looked at her and understood, in a way he could not have articulated and would not have tried to, that he had made a very serious mistake. He did not yet know how many kinds of mistake. That would take longer. Chapter 4. The Beta's Smooth Smile. Ingred Voss had always understood that the most important thing a woman in her position could possess was not beauty, though she had that, or intelligence, though she had that too, but the ability to make other people feel as though her presence was a gift she was generously providing rather than a move she was carefully executing. She had been executing moves since she was 15 years old, and she had never yet lost a room. The morning after Lilli Frogner walked out of the Nordvik forest, Ingrid was at the Beta Council table, presenting the territorial boundary proposal she had spent 3 weeks preparing, when Halvard Ness' aide came to the door and whispered something to him that made the Beta commander's face do the one thing Ingrid had told him, repeatedly, it must never do in a council setting. It moved. Not dramatically. Not in any way that the other council members, who were watching the boundary maps rather than each other, would have noticed. But Ingrid was always watching faces, and what she saw on Halvard's was a very specific variety of controlled alarm, the kind that appears when something you arranged has come undone in a way you did not plan for. She finished her presentation with the same measured precision she would have used if nothing had happened. She answered 2 questions from the Boundary Committee. She thanked the council for their time and gathered her documents and walked out into the corridor and waited exactly 40 seconds for Halvard to follow. She's alive, he said. I assumed, Ingrid said. She walked out of the forest. She went to the healer. Rune says she wasn't injured. She was asking questions. He paused. She went into the stronghold this morning. Marius summoned her. Ingrid turned this over in her mind the way she turned all information over carefully from multiple angles, looking for the point of leverage. She had designed the treason charge with the particular care of someone who understood that a fabrication only holds as long as the fabricated person remains easy to dismiss. A dead woman was easy to dismiss. A disgraced exile was easy to dismiss. A woman who walked back into the Alpha King's war room 3 days after her own death sentence and asked to be useful was something else entirely. What did she tell him? Ingrid said, I don't know yet. Find out. Ingrid. Quietly, she said. Nothing dramatic. We don't need dramatic. We need information. She looked at him with the particular patience she reserved for moments when he was beginning to lose his nerve, which was happening with increasing frequency and which she filed away as a problem that would eventually require its own solution. Halvard. She has no status. She has no standing. She is a branded traitor who survived a death sentence on a technicality. Whatever she tells him as nothing. He has no reason to believe her over you. Unless she has documentation. Ingrid was quiet for a moment. Does she have documentation? She named 4 of my wolves to Torben. By name. With dates. The corridor was empty. Somewhere in the stronghold, a door closed. Ingrid stood very still and recalculated. She had underestimated Lilli Frogner once before, had written her off as lovesick and therefore manageable, had built the treason charge on the assumption that a woman defined by her attachment to a man who didn't want her would be too emotionally devastated to think clearly about anything else. That assumption had been correct for 4 years. The girl who attended pack gatherings with her heart in her eyes and cried in corridors and wrote letters she never sent, that girl would not have been paying attention to border patrol schedules and supply requisitions. But something had changed in that forest. She had seen it in Lily's eyes in the 1 second their gazes had met before the guards moved. Not devastation, not defeat, but something cold and clear and entirely new. She thought about what it would mean for that coldness to have been present, undetected, for longer than anyone realized. She thought about what a woman with that kind of intelligence could observe in 4 years of being dismissed as a fixture, attending every council-adjacent event, present at every dinner where ranked wolves talked freely because the Omega in the corner wasn't listening. We need to know exactly what she has, Ingrid said. And then we need to put her somewhere that information becomes inadmissible. She straightened her cuffs with the practiced calm of someone closing a meeting that had gone well. She has no standing. Use that. Find the right council member, the right procedural avenue. Whatever she brings to Marius, there is a formal mechanism to challenge its source. She looked at Halvard steadily. She is not the problem. She is a distraction from the problem. Manage the distraction, and the problem solves itself. Halvard nodded. He was better when he had instructions. He always had been. That was, Ingrid reflected, both his most useful quality and the thing that would eventually make him expendable. She returned to her chambers and sat at her writing desk and composed a note to 3 council members whose opinions on source credibility and intelligence matters she knew to be, with the right framing, reliably flexible. She wrote in her precise, unhurried hand. She sealed each note with the high beta seal that Marius had given her on the occasion of her appointment, the seal that meant official business, the seal that people opened before they thought too carefully about whether they should. Then she sat back and thought about Lilli Frogner sitting in the war room, laying out border intelligence across Marius Rikstad's tactical maps. She thought about Marius's face, if he was actually listening. She permitted herself, very briefly, the smallest edge of something that was not quite worry, not because she was afraid of being caught, but because she was, in her way, a professional, and professionals respected capable opposition. Then she put the feeling away, because she had never yet lost a room, and she did not intend to start now. Chapter 5. A Woman Worth Watching. The war room was designed to be intimidating. Lilli had understood this immediately upon entering it for the first time, at a packed dinner 3 years ago when she had been allowed to attend as a peripheral guest and had spent most of the evening standing near the walls cataloging the room's architectural choices. High ceiling, dark stone, the tactical maps built into the central table rather than hung on walls, which meant everyone stood, which meant no one was comfortable, which meant the room itself enforced a particular kind of engagement.
No chairs.
No place to settle. Every conversation conducted on your feet, with the maps in front of you and the alpha at the head of the table and the clear, structural message that this was a room for decisions, not discussions. She appreciated it now. Standing was fine. She had been sitting on a cot in a cold storehouse for 2 days. There were 4 ranked wolves arranged around the table when she entered, 2 beta commanders she recognized, 1 she didn't, and Torben Haug standing slightly apart from the others with the expression of a man who has placed a bet and is now waiting to find out if he was right. Marius Rikstad stood at the head of the table with his hands resting on the map's edge and watched her cross the room without changing his expression. She did not look at him directly. Not yet. She looked at the map. It was a detailed rendering of Nordvik territory and its 5 tributary packs, with border incident markers placed at every reported location from the past quarter. Halvard's summary had placed them in a pattern that suggested random rogue activity along the western boundary. What they actually showed, when you looked at the raw distribution without the narrative layered over it, was a very deliberate eastern concentration with western decoys. Here, she said, stepping to the table and placing 2 fingers at the eastern boundary cluster. And here. These 3. She moved to the second group. These aren't random. The intervals are 12 days apart, standard rotation cycle for the eastern patrol units, which means whoever designed this knew the rotation schedule. She paused. The western incidents are noise. They're designed to pull surveillance coverage. The eastern boundary is where the actual traffic is. No one said anything. She continued. The falsified resolution reports on incidents 14, 17, and 22 each cite the same secondary source, a Gamma unit under Commander Haug's direct division. She looked at the map, not at Marius. That unit has not been officially assigned to Eastern Patrol in 3 quarters. If they're appearing in Eastern Resolution reports, someone moved them informally. Someone who has the authority to redeploy Gamma units without formal requisition. She had laid it out. She waited. The beta commander she didn't recognize looked at Marius. The 2 she did recognize looked at the map. Torben looked at Lilli with the expression of a man who had been right about his bet and was deciding whether to be relieved or alarmed by this. Clear the room, Marius said. The commanders filed out. Torben was last. He glanced at Lilli once before he closed the door, a look that contained several things, one of which was something close to apology. Then it was just the 2 of them, and the map and the fire and the particular quality of silence that exists in a room with a person you have not spoken to since the last thing you said to them was a formal rejection before an audience of several hundred wolves. Lilli kept her eyes on the map. How do you know this? Marius said. Not how did you learn this? Not where did this come from? How do you know this? The phrasing of a man who is asking about the quality of the intelligence, its certainty, its depth. I paid attention, she said. For 4 years. Packed dinners, assembly briefings, council-adjacent events. She paused. I was easy to overlook. People say things in front of fixtures. She allowed herself one flat look in his direction. I attended a lot of things I wasn't particularly welcome at. It turns out that's useful. He was looking at her the way she had seen him look at tactical problems, the focused, analytical assessment of someone trying to determine where the weight of a situation actually lay. She had catalogued that look too, once, and attached feelings to it. She felt none of those feelings now. What she felt instead was the clean, functional awareness of being assessed by someone whose assessment mattered, and the choice to return that assessment with equal clarity. "The wolves the report names," he said. "You're certain?" "I have documentation for 2 of them. The third, I have a record pattern that establishes presence where they shouldn't have been, which is circumstantial until it's corroborated." She paused. "It will be corroborated." "By the investigation you're going to open quietly, through a channel that doesn't pass through your beta commander's office." She met his eyes properly for the first time. "I'd suggest Torben Haug. He's loyal to the pack, not to individuals." Marius was still for a moment. Something moved across his face too quickly for her to name. Not anger, not the cold administrative efficiency she remembered from the assembly hall. Something less controlled. He looked away. "You should have come to me with this," he said. "When you first found it." "I know," she said. "I would have." A pause. "I wasn't in a position to at the time. The fire, the map, the specific weight of everything that was not being said." "You can use the quartermaster's office on the east corridor," he said. "It's removed from the main command structure. Torben will come to you there." He paused. "You'll be under my protection as a source." "That's the formal designation." "Not a pack member," she said, clarifying, not objecting. "Not a pack member," he confirmed. She nodded. She had expected nothing else and needed nothing more. Not yet. She picked up the notes she had laid on the table's edge and squared them and held out her hand, and after a moment he gave her the documentation she had come with, and she walked to the door. "Lilli." She stopped. She turned. He was looking at the map, not at her. "The bond," he said, with the particular difficulty of a man who has been carefully not saying a thing and has just decided to say it anyway. "I was told." "I know what you were told," she said. "We'll address it when it becomes relevant." She left. Behind her, through the closed door of the war room, she heard nothing at all, and that nothing had a specific quality to it, the quality of a very controlled, very powerful man standing in a room alone and not knowing what to do with himself, which was the most useful thing she had learned all day. Chapter 6. The conspiracy has a shape now. The quartermaster's office was small and cold and smelled of old paper and iron filings from the weapons inventory stored in the adjacent room. Lilli made it functional within a day. A work table, a chair, 3 lamps, and a system of notations that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't designed it, which was the point. Halvard was the mechanism. Ingred was the architect. Dybvik was the investor. And the thing holding it all together was the simple human fact that each of them had needed something the others could provide, and had therefore created a structure that could not survive the removal of any one of its pieces. That was, she thought, the particular fragility of arrangements built on mutual necessity rather than shared interest. They held perfectly until they didn't. Over the next 4 days, she came to the war room at Marius's request each evening. She brought one new piece of the picture each time, never all at once, not because she was withholding, but because giving a man everything at once is theater. Giving him one clear, verifiable thing per day is a demonstration of reliability. She wanted him thinking of her as a source that had consistently proven accurate before the final piece arrived. Each time she came, he was waiting. He told himself it was because the intelligence was valuable. He may even have believed it. She watched his face during the briefings with the detached attention of someone monitoring a calibration, looking for the specific shifts that would tell her when he had moved past the cognitive framework of source assessment into something more personally engaged. It happened on the 4th evening. A small thing. The way he turned slightly toward the door before Torben announced her, the fraction of a second before he reassembled his expression into administrative neutrality. She noted it. She said nothing. The bond was doing what bonds did when 2 people were in each other's presence repeatedly, building, whether or not either of them was acknowledging the construction. She thought about Ingrid Voss, somewhere in the stronghold, watching Marius's schedule and drawing her own conclusions. She thought about the Grand Alpha Council, 3 weeks away. She worked faster. Chapter 7. What Ingred cannot stand. The pack gathering was Ingred's design, though she had arranged it so that it appeared to be tradition. Once per quarter, the full Nordvik pack, ranked wolves, unranked members, even the outer settlement families, gathered in the assembly hall for what the pack called the open hearing. It was an old ritual, predating the current alpha line by several generations. Any pack member could bring a concern before the gathered assembly, and the alpha or his designated representative would hear it. In practice, the open hearings had become largely ceremonial. Most concerns were procedural. Most proceedings were brief. Ingrid had been attending them for 3 years and waiting, with her characteristic patience, for the right moment to turn one into something useful. The moment arrived with the presence of 4 visiting envoys from the Solvang pack, who had come to Nordvik to finalize a trade agreement and were housed in the stronghold guest quarters. Witnesses. Neutral, ranked, with reporting obligations to their own alpha. Whatever happened in this room tonight would travel beyond Nordvik's borders by morning. She had timed it beautifully. Lilli Frogner was not present when the gathering opened. She had been informed of it through the usual pack channels, which meant Ingrid had arranged for her not to be informed until 30 minutes before it began, which meant she would arrive, if she arrived, after the context had been established. After the frame had been built. Ingrid rose to speak in the 3rd quarter of the hearing, presenting herself as a pack member with a procedural concern rather than as high beta, which was the kind of deliberate understatement she used when she wanted to appear as though she was speaking with personal conscience rather than positional authority. She expressed, with precisely calibrated reluctance, that she felt it was her obligation as a pack member to raise a matter of concern regarding a potential breach of security protocol. She produced documentation, the original treason evidence, the council's verdict documentation, the brand register, and presented it to the gathering with a careful, mournful framing of someone who took no pleasure in any of this, but understood that pack safety required she say something. The Solvang envoys watched with polite attention. The pack members shifted and murmured. This was the atmosphere Ingrid had wanted. Not outrage, but uncertainty. The productive discomfort of a gathering that had been reminded of a troubling thing and was waiting for someone in authority to resolve the discomfort by confirming that the troubling thing was properly contained. She had nearly finished when the hall doors opened. Lilli Frogner walked in wearing the grey wool cloak from Sigrun's chest, her dark hair loose and still slightly tangled from the wind outside, and the expression of someone who has arrived slightly late to a performance they have already read the script for. She surveyed the room in the 3 seconds it took her to cross to an open position near the center of the floor. She saw the documentation on the table. She saw the Solvang envoys. She saw Ingrid's carefully composed face. She asked, pleasantly, if she might address the gathering. Ingrid's first instinct was to object. She contained it because objecting would be visible, and visible was the one thing she could not afford to be right now. She inclined her head with the gracious generosity of someone who had nothing to fear. The room waited. Lilli picked up the treason documentation from the table, looked through it for approximately 15 seconds, and set it back down. Then she began to talk, and what she said for the next 3 minutes had the specific quality of something that had been constructed very carefully in a quiet room and sharpened over the course of several days, to the point where it cut cleanly and completely without requiring any additional force. She did not raise her voice. She did not make it personal. She addressed the council verdict documentation first, noting 4 specific procedural irregularities in the testimony collection that rendered 2 of the 3 primary evidence items technically non-admissible under the same pack law that had been used to convict her. She noted the dates of the testimony collection and cross-referenced them against the pack's formal inquiry timeline, establishing a 12-hour discrepancy that suggested the evidence had been prepared before the investigation that was supposed to produce it. She then addressed the physical documentation, noting 2 specific inconsistencies in the administrative records that anyone with access to the pack's official filing system would be able to verify in approximately 40 minutes. She did not call Ingrid a liar. She did not need to. She simply made the evidence stop meaning what it had been arranged to mean, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of it but paper. The hall was very quiet. The Solvang envoys were no longer watching with polite attention. They were watching with the focused alertness of people whose job required them to understand, quickly and accurately, what they were actually witnessing. Ingrid kept her expression composed. This was the finest performance of her adult life. Lilli set the last document on the table and looked at the gathering with the calm, measured quality of someone who has finished a presentation and is ready for questions. If there are procedural questions about any of the specific items, she said, I'm happy to walk through them in detail.
She paused.
I don't believe that will be necessary. It was not necessary. The gathering was dismissed 40 minutes later. The treason documentation was formally flagged for review by the council clerk, which meant it was functionally suspended, inadmissible as a basis for any further action until the review was complete. Ingrid walked back to her chambers and did not speak to anyone. She sat at her writing desk and looked at the wall and thought about Lilli Frogner, who had just done in 3 minutes what Ingrid had told herself was impossible. She had made the room doubt the architecture of an arrangement that had taken 14 months to build. She was not afraid yet, but she was recalibrating, which was the closest she ever came to it. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write a message to Halvard Ness. The message said, It is time. Chapter 8. What the Alpha King Feels. Marius Rikstad did not know what to do with the feeling. That was the most disorienting part, not the feeling itself, but the unfamiliarity of not knowing. He had governed 5 packs for 6 years. He had managed border wars and succession disputes and famine and alliance fractures, and in all of it he had known, with the absolute, bedrock certainty of a man who had been raised since childhood to be the room's primary instrument of resolution, what to do. The knowing had never failed him. It was not arrogance. It was the deep, functional confidence of someone whose intelligence and instincts had been tested enough times under real conditions to be trusted without question. The feeling he had now defied that confidence completely. It was not guilt. He had felt guilt before, the clean, actionable variety that identified an error and drove immediate correction. This was something more structural. A foundational recalibration, the slow, grinding sense that a premise he had accepted as settled was not settled at all, and that every decision built upon that premise therefore required review. He had rejected Lilli Frogner based on evidence that 4 people had reviewed and found conclusive. He had not questioned it because Halvard had brought it and Halvard had served him for 6 years with perfect loyalty, and because the evidence itself was thorough, and because this was the part he returned to in the dark hours before dawn, the part he could not look at directly, because it had been easier than the alternative. Because the alternative was acknowledging that a woman who looked at him the way she had looked at him, with that complete and devastating openness, was a problem he did not know how to solve. He had solved it by accepting a convenient narrative. He understood that now. He had not understood it 3 days ago. He called for Torben at midnight on the 4th day after the open hearing. Torben arrived quickly, dressed but not armored, which meant he had been awake. Sit down, Marius said. Torben sat. The bond, Marius said, without any further setup. In your experience, and I understand you are not a spiritual authority on the matter, does a verbal rejection sever it? Torben was quiet for a long moment. He was choosing his words with the particular care of a man who had been waiting for this question and was not going to waste the answer by saying too much. In my understanding, Torben said, a verbal rejection severs the formal acknowledgement. The pact recognizes the bond as closed. The legal and social structures treat it as dissolved. He paused. Whether the bond itself, the actual connection, responds to a verbal severing depends, as I understand it, on whether the bond accepts the conditions under which the rejection was made. Marius looked at the fire. What does that mean? It means, Torben said carefully, that a bond formed between fated mates is not a social arrangement. It is something older, and older things have their own logic about what constitutes valid grounds for dissolution. He paused again. A rejection made on the basis of false information, delivered under conditions manufactured by people with something to gain. I would not, personally, expect that older logic to comply with the formal verdict. Silence. She's not broken, Marius said. It was not a question. No, Torben said. She is not. He stopped. He turned away from the fire and looked at the wall where, in the dark, he could almost see the layout of the war room table, the way she stood at it without leaning, the the way her eyes moved across maps with the specific focus of a person who sees not what is represented, but what is implied. "What is she, Torben?" "I think," Torben said, with the care of a man who understood that what he said next would matter for some time. "She is what she always was." We were looking in the wrong direction. Marius dismissed him. He stood at the window for a long time after, looking at the dark courtyard and thinking about a woman who had been branded a traitor and walked out of a forest and walked back into a stronghold and had not once, in all of it, asked him for anything except access to a map. He thought about what that required. Not the intelligence. The intelligence was extraordinary, but intelligence alone didn't explain it. What it required was the decision not to collapse. The decision, at the bottom of the worst thing that had ever happened to her, to stand up and move forward rather than down and inward. He had thought, standing at the throne in the assembly hall, that he was watching a girl's attachment to a man who didn't want her come to its proper, unambiguous conclusion. He had been watching something entirely different, and he had not known because he had not looked. The next morning, Halvard Ness filed a formal complaint demanding that Lilli Frogner be expelled from the stronghold on the grounds of the existing treason designation, which had not yet been formally cleared by the pending council review. Marius denied it in under 10 seconds. He did not discuss it. He did not explain it. He did not offer Halvard the courtesy of appearing to consider the argument. It was the first time in 6 years he had denied Halvard Ness anything. From the expression on his beta commander's face, Halvard understood exactly what it meant. Chapter 9. The night Halvard makes his move. 2 days before the Grand Alpha Council, Lilli finished the financial thread. She had found it late in the evening. Torben had brought the treasury records that afternoon, and she had worked through them for 4 hours before the sequence emerged, the particular chain of disbursements that left the Nordvik treasury through a series of administrative accounts that looked, individually, like routine operational costs and arrived, collectively, in an account registered to a wolf named Strand Kviberg, which was not a name that meant anything until you checked the registry of Nordvik wolves against the administrative employment records and found that Strand Kviberg had died 8 years ago and his administrative designation had never been formally closed. A dead wolf's account, receiving active payments for 6 months, routed, with 3 intermediate steps, to an external institution with a territorial address in Einar Dybvik's eastern province. She laid it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. This was the final piece. Not the most dramatic piece. That would be Halvard's handwriting on the letter she had found 2 weeks ago, the letter addressed directly to Dybvik that she had been holding in reserve. But the financial chain was the one that made everything else irrefutable. You could argue intent. You could argue interpretation. You could not argue with 6 months of money moving from the Nordvik treasury to Einar Dybvik's province through a dead man's account. She needed to get this to Marius tonight. She packed the documents into her satchel in the order she would present them. Financial chain first, assignment log second, correspondence last, the letter last of all, because the letter was the door, and everything else was the evidence that the door led somewhere real. She was 3 steps from her chamber door when she heard, in the corridor outside, the specific sound of 2 sets of boots moving with a quiet, deliberate tread of people who do not want to be heard. She stopped. She had prepared for this. Not because she had known the specific night, but because she had understood, from the moment Halvard's complaint was denied, that he would not wait much longer. A man with that much exposure, who loses his primary instrument of protection, does not deliberate. He acts, and he acts fast, and he does not do it through official channels. Her chamber was empty. She had made it empty 2 hours ago, when she moved the documents to the satchel she was now carrying and the satchel to her person, and herself to the doorway where she was currently standing, coat on, boots on, ready to be somewhere else. She left through the service corridor. The stronghold had service corridors that dated from its original construction, when the Pax builders had understood something the current administrative class had apparently forgotten, that a stronghold with only primary corridors was a trap. She had mapped them in her first week, noted the access points, timed the patrol routes on the 3 evenings she had stayed late in the war room, and walked back to the quartermaster's office in the dark. She moved through the service passage quickly, came out in the lower level near the weapon storage, crossed the inner courtyard under the shadow of the eastern wall, and went up the secondary stairs to the war room level. Marius was at the table. He looked up when she entered. He had learned over the past week not to react visibly to her arrivals, but she had also learned to read the very small things, the slight adjustment in posture, the deliberate relaxation of attention she might not have noticed if she had not once spent 4 years memorizing the texture of his attention. "Halvard sent 2 wolves to my chamber," she said. "It's empty. They'll report back in approximately 12 minutes. He came around the table. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said, setting the satchel on the table. "I have the complete chain." She looked at him directly. "All of it. Tonight." He stood close. Too close for a source briefing, but she had stopped thinking of their interactions in those terms 3 days ago, when she had noticed the angle at which he turned toward the sound of the door before she opened it, and had filed it not under operational variables, but somewhere older and less organized. She laid the financial records on the table. She talked him through the chain, the debt account, the disbursement sequence, the Dybvik destination. She laid the assignment logs beside it, showing the Gamma unit movements that matched the border access dates. She put the council correspondence alongside, the messages between the Nordvik liaison office and Dybvik's territory that established the relationship. Then she reached into the satchel and took out the letter. A single folded paper, sealed with Halvard Nest's personal mark. Addressed to Alpha Einar Dybvik. Retrieved 3 weeks ago from the Secondary Administrative Archive by Sigrun Blix, who had been given authorization to collect an old supply record from that archive and had, while collecting it, noted the letter filed in the wrong section and brought it to Lilli without comment, because Sigrun Blix had been paying attention to Halvard Ness for 6 months longer than anyone else and understood what she was looking at. Marius opened the letter. He read it. She watched his face and watched the particular transition that happened in it, not surprise, exactly, because she suspected he had known for some time that something was wrong, but the settling of a weight. The moment when a thing you suspected becomes a thing you know, and the knowing is, in its way, heavier than the suspecting. He set the letter on the table carefully. "He's been in my house for 6 years, Marius said. He was not talking to her. He was talking to the wall, to the fire, to the specific silence of someone who has just measured the full distance of a betrayal and needs a moment before he can turn back to the business of what to do about it." She gave him the moment. Then, "The council is in 2 days. "Yes," he said. "Ingrid will move at the council. She has a plan. She's been positioning herself for 3 weeks. She needs the council chamber because a public action with multiple alpha witnesses gives her the social cover that a private action doesn't. What will she do? Discredit me publicly before I can present any of this formally. She'll use the treason designation. It hasn't been formally cleared yet." She paused. "She'll try to have me removed from the council proceedings as a compromised source." Marius looked at her. The firelight, the letter on the table between them, the entire architecture of the past 3 weeks visible in the room around them, laid out in notes and records and careful, patient work. "She won't succeed," he said. "No," Lilli agreed. "She won't." She held his gaze. "But how she fails matters. For the 5 packs. For what the council understands about what happened here." She paused. "I need to be the one who presents the evidence. Not you, not Torben. Me. You have no formal standing." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "You'll have to give me some. The fire. The silence. The weight of what that meant, structurally, legally, personally. At the council," he said slowly, "I could designate you as a formal intelligence source under Alpha protection. That gives you standing to present evidence." He paused. "It also requires me to formally acknowledge that I accepted your intelligence as credible, which means acknowledging that the original treason designation was wrong," she said. "Yes." He was quiet. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I'm not asking for your sake. I'm asking because it is the only mechanism that makes the evidence admissible and the council action clean." She held his gaze without flinching. "The 5 packs need a clean resolution. Not a version of this where the source is ambiguous." Marius looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter in Halvard's handwriting and the financial chain and the months of patient, invisible work laid out across his war room table. "Be at the council chamber when it opens," he said. "I'll handle the designation." She picked up her satchel and walked to the door. "Lilli." She stopped, turned. He was looking at the table, not at her, which was the way he dealt with things that were harder than tactical problems. I should have looked, he said, quietly, simply, with none of the administrative efficiency she remembered from the assembly hall. I should have looked at the evidence myself instead of accepting a summary. I should have. Yes, she said, not unkindly. You should have.
She paused.
There will be time for that later. She left him with the letter and the fire and the particular silence of a man rebuilding a premise from the ground up, in the dark, 2 days before the thing that would require him to do it in public. Chapter 10. The Grand Alpha Council and What Comes After. The Grand Alpha Council of the 5 Nordvik packs met in the Great Hall of Rikstad Keep, in a room designed for exactly this purpose. Long stone table, 5 seating positions for the Alpha delegates, gallery seating for pack representatives and formal witnesses, and a speaker's position at the room's focal point where the floor was raised by 2 stone steps, not enough to dominate, enough to be seen. Lilli stood against the eastern wall when the council opened, in the position that Marius had designated for her in the formal seating arrangement, not at the table, which was reserved for the Alpha delegation, but in the front gallery row, with the formal designation marker of Alpha Intelligence Source attached to her credentials by the Nordvik Council clerk that morning. Ingrid had seen it. She had seen it, and her face had not changed, because Ingrid's face never changed, but Lilli had been watching her long enough to see the calculation beneath the surface, the rapid recalibration, the assessment of available moves, the selection. Halvard was not present. Halvard was currently in the stronghold's holding cells, which Marius had authorized at dawn, quietly and without public announcement, on the basis of the financial evidence and the letter. His absence from the council chamber was itself a statement for anyone paying close enough attention, but Ingrid was not the kind of person who abandoned a plan because one of its components had been removed. She adapted. She adapted by doing the most unexpected thing available to her. In the second hour of the council proceedings, after the formal territorial reports had been presented and the trade agreements filed, Ingrid Voss rose from her gallery position, requested the floor as a witness with material information relevant to pack security, and proceeded, with the flawless composure of a woman who had rehearsed this version of events across every contingency, to present herself as a whistleblower. She had been manipulated, she said. She had been brought into Halvard Ness's confidence under false pretenses, had believed, initially, that the evidence she helped compile against Lilli Frogner was legitimate, and had only recently come to understand that she had been used as a tool in a larger conspiracy she had not fully comprehended. She was coming forward now, she said, because the evidence of Halvard's true actions was too serious to suppress regardless of personal cost. She expressed, with her characteristic precisely calibrated grief, deep regret for any role she had played. It was extraordinary. It was the most controlled piece of adversarial performance Lilli had ever witnessed in person, and she had sat in on a hostile acquisition hearing in her previous life that had lasted 11 hours. The council chamber wavered. She could feel it, the collective uncertainty of 5 Alpha delegates and their representatives, looking at a beautiful, composed woman expressing regret with apparent sincerity and doing the arithmetic of what is the cost of believing her versus the cost of not believing her. Marius looked at Lilli. Lilli reached into her satchel. She had anticipated this version. She had actually anticipated it first, before the direct attack version, because Ingrid was too smart for a direct attack in a room with 5 neutral Alpha witnesses and a woman who had just been given formal credentialed standing. The whistleblower move was elegant. It was the move Lilli would have made, in Ingrid's position. She had prepared accordingly. She requested the floor. The council chair, an elder delegate from the Vardo pack, who had been watching the proceedings with the focused attention of a man who understood that what happened in this room today would define the political landscape of the Northern Territories for a generation, granted it. She walked to the speaker's position. 2 steps up. The room visible. She did not begin with the financial evidence. She began with the communications. 14 months of correspondence between Ingrid Voss and Halvard Ness, retrieved from the Council Liaison Archive and the secondary administrative records, and In 3 cases, from the private post registry that Sigrun Blix had accessed through the particular license of a pack healer who had treated, at various points, every administrative clerk in the stronghold and had asked, over the years, for very little in return. The communications were dated, signed, and sequenced. They told a story, not Ingrid's story, not Halvard's story, but the story that the documents themselves told when placed in chronological order and read without editorializing. The original instruction to fabricate the treason evidence was in Ingrid's handwriting. The date was 6 weeks before the charge was formally filed. The instruction was specific, detailed, and addressed to Halvard by first name with the particular casual authority of a person who had been directing another person for long enough that the directions had become routine. Lilli read the relevant passage aloud. I stand before this council, he said, and his voice was clear enough that the 3 delegates still gathering documents at the far end of the table looked up, and I correct the record. He held her gaze. Lilli Frogner was wrongly convicted on fabricated evidence. The rejection made before the Nordvik Assembly was made on the basis of false information and does not reflect my judgment. He paused. I was wrong. That is the record. The council chair, who had been in the process of leaving, had stopped. The Vardo delegate and one of the solving envoys were watching from the gallery entrance. Torbenhaug, standing near the side door, was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone trying very hard not to have an expression. Lilli Frogner looked at Marius Rikstad standing at the foot of the speaker's steps, the most powerful Alpha King in 5 generations, who had never before in the history of his tenure admitted error in a formal setting, who was doing it now in front of 3 Alpha delegates and a Solvang envoy and 2 council clerks and whatever the gods were paying attention to this particular afternoon. And she took her time. She was allowed, she thought, to take her time. I heard you, she said. Is that sufficient, he said. I'm asking formally. She considered. No, she said. It is not sufficient. She descended the 2 steps. It's a start. She stood in front of him, close enough that she could see exactly what was in his face, which was not the administrative clarity she remembered from the assembly hall, and was not the careful neutrality he had maintained across weeks of war room briefings, but something much less organized and much more honest. I have conditions. I know, he said. You don't know them yet. I know you have them, he said. That is enough. Tell me. From somewhere behind them, the gallery, she thought, or possibly the side door, she heard the Vardo delegate make a sound. It was not quiet a laugh. It was the sound a very composed person makes when they are suppressing something undignified. She told him the first condition, which was procedural, formal reinstatement, clean record, council documentation. He agreed. She told him the second condition, which was structural, a formal independent review mechanism for intelligence sourcing that did not route through the beta command structure exclusively. He agreed and asked 2 questions about the architecture that told her he had been thinking about it already. She told him the third condition. This one took longer. It required her to say things she had spent 2 lifetimes not saying, about what trust looked like and what its absence felt like, and what she needed it to look like going forward, specifically and in practical terms, without sentiment or abstraction. He listened without interrupting. That was, she noted, new. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. 1 word. She believed it. The bond, the thing that had survived a verbal rejection and an iron brand and a winter forest and 14 months of conspiracy and 3 weeks of tactical briefings and 48 hours of documents, did the particular thing bonds do when 2 people stop organizing their lives around the task of avoiding them. It settled. Not dramatically. Not with light or heat or the romantic apparatus of faction fiction. It settled the way foundations settle, quietly, completely, with the specific, reliable weight of something built to last. I have 1 more condition, she said. Yes, he said, without waiting to hear it. Then, reading her expression, that was arrogant. What is it? The Nordvik Council needs a formal intelligence function that isn't dependent on the beta command structure, she said, with a director position. He looked at her. Yourself, he said. Myself, she confirmed. The council chair, who had given up pretending to gather his documents and was simply watching, cleared his throat. Alpha Rikstad, he said, with the particular dry courtesy of a man who had witnessed many historic moments and knew how to mark them without overstatement. I believe I speak for the assembled delegates when I say that this has been the most productive Grand Alpha Council in my 30 years of attendance. He paused. The vote on the intelligence function proposal will, I expect, be unanimous. It was. The records note, in the official council minutes for that session, that the proceedings were marked by extraordinary efficiency in the resolution of all outstanding matters. What the records do not capture, because the clerk had stepped out for water, is what the solvang envoy said to the Vardo delegate as they left the chamber, which was, in essence, that whatever that woman had been before, she was the most dangerous thing in 5 packs now, and that the Alpha King looked at her like he knew it and found it, against all reasonable expectation, an enormous relief. Outside the keep, the Nordvik Winter was doing what Nordvik Winters did, pressing forward, indifferent to the events of the humans and wolves within it, moving through the trees with a cold, old patience that predated the pack hierarchy by several thousand years. Lilli Frogner walked out of the Grand Alpha Council chamber into that cold with her satchel on her shoulder and the formal reinstatement documentation in her hands and the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been chained in a forest clearing 7 weeks ago with a death order on her head and had decided, in that moment, not to stay chained. Marius walked beside her. He did not take her hand immediately. He waited until they had crossed the courtyard and were through the gate and away from the formal architecture of the keep, away from witnesses and proceedings and the weight of institutional observation, and then he took it, not with the careful, managed precision he applied to most things, but simply, directly, the way a person reaches for something they have been told repeatedly they cannot have and have finally decided to stop believing. She let him. She even, quietly, held on. Behind them, through the keep's high windows, the last light of the winter afternoon was catching on the wolf-carved beams of the council chamber ceiling, 300 years of Nordvik bloodlines looking down at the cleared table, the vacated seats, the particular stillness of a room in which things had been decided. Ingred Voss would answer to the council review board. Halvard Ness would face the full-pack tribunal. Einar Dybvik would negotiate his way through a treaty violation that had become considerably more expensive than he had planned. These things would take time and produce their own complications as things do. But none of that was tonight. Tonight was cold and clear, and the wolves in the Nordvik forest were moving through the trees in their own patterns, attending to their own ancient business, and in the courtyard of Rikstad Keep, the Alpha King and the woman he had nearly destroyed were walking in the same direction. Which was, as it turned out, enough.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.